It is the morning of July 3rd, 1944. The forests of East Prussia breathe with an unnatural stillness. Somewhere inside the dense canopy of pine and birch, buried beneath reinforced concrete and layers of camouflage netting, lies the Wolfschanze, the Wolf's Lair, Adolf Hitler's Eastern Command headquarters. The air inside smells of damp stone and stale tobacco. Officers move through corridors in hushed, careful steps, their faces carrying the particular pallor of men who have received news they do not yet know how to repeat aloud. A map board dominates the main briefing room. It is enormous, stretching nearly the length of one wall, covered in colored markings, unit designations, arrows, and frontline positions. But something about this map, on this particular morning, is profoundly wrong. Where there should be ordered lines of German formations, where there should be the firm, controlled geometry of military organization, there is instead a wound. A gap so vast, so catastrophic, that the staff officers standing before it have quietly, and without any official word, stopped updating certain sections. Because there is nothing left to update. The units that once held those positions no longer exist. What was unfolding in the summer of 1944, in the forests and marshlands of Belarusia, was not merely a military setback. It was the single largest defeat in the history of the German army. Larger than Stalingrad, larger than the bloodletting of Kursk, larger than anything the Wehrmacht had ever experienced or had ever allowed itself to imagine was possible. It was the destruction of Army Group Center. And the German generals who learned of it, one report at a time, one shattered division at a time, would never fully recover from what they discovered. To understand the weight of this catastrophe, one must first understand what Army Group Center meant to Germany. Since the opening hours of Operation Barbarossa on June 22, 1941, Army Group Center had been the iron spine of Germany's war in the East. It was the formation that had driven deepest into Soviet territory in those first intoxicating weeks of Blitzkrieg, capturing hundreds of thousands of Red Army prisoners in the great encirclement battles of Minsk, Smolensk, and Kiev. It had stood at the gates of Moscow in the autumn of 1941, so close that German officers claimed they could see the spires of the Kremlin glinting in the winter light through their field binoculars. It was, in the minds of the German High Command, the embodiment of everything the Wehrmacht believed itself to be: professional, ruthless, tactically superior, and forged across 3 years of continental war into a blade of incomparable lethality. Its divisions bore names and numbers that meant something in the language of German martial pride. Its soldiers wore the Iron Cross on their tunics and carried with them the accumulated experience of 1,000 desperate engagements from the frozen mud of the Moscow approaches to the burnt-out ruins of Vitebsk. By the spring of 1944, German intelligence had been watching the Soviet front lines east of Belarusia with growing, if carefully suppressed, anxiety. The Red Army was massing. Soviet rail lines were carrying more supplies and more men westward than had ever been recorded. German aerial reconnaissance reported enormous supply dumps deep behind enemy lines, fields filled with artillery pieces and tanks camouflaged under canvas and foliage. And yet the German generals at Army Group Center's headquarters in Minsk held to a conviction that had sustained them through 3 years of the most punishing warfare in recorded history. They believed the Soviet army was still, fundamentally, the Red Army of 1941. Poorly coordinated, heavily reliant on mass rather than maneuver. Capable of suffering, but incapable of the kind of sophisticated, multi-pronged operational thinking that had defined German military doctrine since the days of Schlieffen and Moltke. This was not merely arrogance. It was a belief so deeply embedded in German military culture, reinforced by so many individual tactical victories, that it had acquired the character of an unexamined truth. They were catastrophically wrong. The Soviet operation that was coming had been planned for nearly 6 months in absolute secrecy, a feat of deception so elaborate and so carefully maintained that it constitutes one of the greatest intelligence triumphs of the entire war. The Soviets fed German intelligence false information, suggesting the next major offensive would come farther south, against Army Group North Ukraine. They moved men and equipment only at night. Truck and tank movements were conducted without lights, scheduled to coincide with thunderstorms and low cloud cover that grounded German reconnaissance aircraft. Soviet commanders were not even briefed on their full objectives until the final days before launch. The entire operation was given a name that carried a silent, deliberate symbolism: Bagration. Name for Prince Pyotr Bagration, the Georgian-born Russian general mortally wounded defending his homeland against Napoleon's invasion in 1812. The echoes were intentional. At 5:00 in the morning on June 22, 1944, exactly 3 years to the very day since Hitler had launched Operation Barbarossa, the guns opened. The Soviet artillery barrage that struck the German lines at the opening of Operation Bagration was not like any preparatory bombardment the Wehrmacht had experienced before. More than 6,000 artillery pieces and multiple rocket launchers fired simultaneously along a front stretching nearly 400 miles. The earth itself shook. German soldiers in forward positions described the sound not as thunder, but as something beneath thunder, a vibration felt in the chest and the teeth before it was heard by the ears. The barrage did not simply suppress German positions. It methodically, systematically, and with practiced Soviet precision, erased them. Command bunkers were destroyed in the first hours. Communication lines were severed. And before the dust of the bombardment had fully settled, more than 1.5 million Soviet soldiers, 1,600 tanks, and 24,000 artillery pieces began moving forward. The reports that reached Field Marshal Ernst Busch at Army Group Center headquarters in those first hours were confused, fragmented, and deeply alarming. Busch was a loyal and obedient man, the kind of commander who owed his field marshal's baton less to strategic brilliance than to his unwillingness to challenge Hitler's increasingly rigid operational directives. He had been ordered to hold the so-called firm places, a series of fortified cities designated by Hitler as positions to be defended to the last man, regardless of tactical circumstance. Vitebsk, Orsha, Mogilev, Bobruisk. These were not merely defensive positions. They were ideological commitments, a declaration that the Wehrmacht would not yield ground, that the spirit of National Socialist Germany would hold the line against Slavic barbarism by the force of pure German will. Busch had complied with these orders. He had organized his forces around these cities. And in doing so, he had created the conditions for a catastrophe of almost unimaginable proportions. Because the Soviet plan was not to assault the fortified cities directly. It was to flow around them. 4 Soviet army groups, called fronts, struck simultaneously along multiple axes of advance, punching through the gaps between the German strongpoints, bypassing the fortress cities, and racing deep into the German rear. Within 48 hours of the offensive's opening, entire German corps had been encircled. The 53rd Army Corps at Vitebsk, 5 divisions, approximately 35,000 men, was surrounded so rapidly that Busch initially did not believe the reports. The 9th Army at Bobruisk found itself fighting in 4 directions at once as Soviet armored columns reached roads and bridges that the German command had assumed were safely behind their own lines. The map board at Army Group Center's headquarters was being redrawn faster than the staff officers could mark it. Divisions that had been recorded as fully operational at morning briefing were listed as scattered by afternoon and destroyed by evening. Unit commanders were radioing for instructions from positions that were no longer adjacent to any other German formation. Some radio transmissions simply stopped, and the terrible arithmetic of what was happening began, slowly and then with gathering momentum, to resolve itself into a number that no German general could look at without feeling something shift and break in their understanding of the war they were fighting. In the first week alone, 3 German armies had effectively ceased to exist as coherent fighting forces. The news reached the Wolfschanze in layers. First came the confused initial reports, the kind that generals in every war have learned to read cautiously, knowing that the chaos of battle distorts early information. Then came the confirming reports, each one worse than the last. Then came the silence from certain headquarters that should not have gone silent. And finally, in the early days of July, came the full accounting, or as full an accounting as could be constructed, from the wreckage of command and communication. That was all that remained of Army Group Center's operational infrastructure. Of the 38 divisions that had constituted Army Group Center on the morning of June 22, 1944, 28 had been destroyed. Not damaged, not depleted, destroyed, gone. Their commanding officers killed, wounded, captured, or missing. Their men dead in Belarusian marshes, marching into Soviet captivity, or scattered in small, desperate groups trying to find their way back to what remained of German lines across hundreds of miles of enemy-controlled territory. Official German figures, always conservative in their accounting of disaster, cited some 26,000 killed and 110,000 wounded. But the true figure, including those listed simply as missing, a Wehrmacht euphemism that rarely meant anything hopeful, was closer to 400,000 men. A quarter of Germany's entire strength on the Eastern Front, consumed in less than 9 weeks. General Kurt Zeitzler, the Chief of Staff of the Army High Command, the OK, had been in his position since 1942. He was not a man given to emotional display. He had navigated the nightmare of Stalingrad. He had presided over the grinding attrition of Kursk. He had stood in briefing rooms and delivered figures so terrible that they should have broken ordinary men. But something about the reports coming from Belarusia in late June of 1944 crossed a threshold that his professional stoicism could no longer contain. At the end of June, Zeitzler told Hitler directly, in words that no German general in good standing was meant to say aloud, that the war was militarily lost, that the situation in the East had passed beyond the point at which any military solution was possible. Hitler's response was rage. Zeitzler suffered what was recorded, with clinical German bureaucratic terminology, as a nervous breakdown. He was quietly dismissed from his post. The extraordinary document of a chief of staff, collapsing under the weight of the truth he had been forced to carry, and then dismissed for having dared to speak it, tells the entire story of the German High Command in the summer of 1944. There is a particular kind of stillness that settles over a professional soldier when he learns that something he believed to be undestroyable has been destroyed. It is not the same as fear. The German generals who had survived the years of German conquest, who had stood in Paris and in the Caucasus, and at the edge of Moscow and at the gates of Alexandria, were not men who frightened easily. What settled over them now was something stranger and more corrosive than fear. It was the collapse of a narrative. For 3 years, the story the Wehrmacht told itself was a story of inevitable supremacy, of German tactical genius, of Aryan martial spirit, of a military culture so superior to its opponents that even setbacks were only temporary corrections in a trajectory that pointed ultimately toward German victory. Stalingrad had cracked that narrative. Kursk had cracked it further. But even after those catastrophes, a man of sufficient ideological conviction could construct explanations. Hitler's interference, flanks compromised by Allied formations of lower quality, logistical failures, the brutal Russian winter. There was always an explanation that left the core belief intact. Operation Bagration offered no such escape. The Red Army of 1944 had not simply outnumbered the Wehrmacht. It had outplanned it, outmaneuvered it, outdeceived it, and outfought it at the operational level, the very level at which German doctrine held that no enemy could ever achieve superiority. The Soviet commanders who designed and executed Bagration, Zhukov, Rokossovsky, Vasilevsky, had demonstrated a mastery of the deep battle concept, of coordinating massive multi-front operations across hundreds of miles of front that was not merely equal to German operational. In the conditions of 1944, it surpassed it. Heinz Guderian, the father of German armored warfare, and a man not given to understatement in matters of military judgment, had written with uncharacteristic humility, "We have severely underestimated the Russians, the extent of the country, and the treachery of the climate. This is the revenge of reality." The revenge of reality. 4 words that contained within them the full weight of everything the German High Command had refused to understand about the war they had chosen to fight. On July 17, 1944, 3 weeks after the opening of Bagration, and while its battles were still consuming German units by the day, The Soviet government arranged a spectacle of such calculated and devastating symbolism that it would echo through the corridors of history long after the guns fell. Silent. 57,000 German prisoners of war, captured in the Belarusian catastrophe, were marched through the streets of Moscow. It was called the Parade of the Vanquished. The column was led by 19 German generals, men who had commanded divisions and corps, men who wore the Knight's Cross and the oak leaves and the swords, men who had once stood before their troops as the embodiment of German invincibility. They walked now through a Soviet capital they had once dreamed of occupying, through streets lined with hundreds of thousands of Moscow's citizens, many of whom had lost fathers and sons and brothers to the army these men had commanded. Moscow street cleaners followed the column with hoses and brushes, washing away the passage of the defeated. The gesture was deliberate. The streets of the Soviet capital would not be permanently marked by German boots. When the column had passed, the city cleaned itself of them, as though they had never been. Among the German high command, the Parade of the Vanquished produced a silence that spoke more clearly than any report. These were the same generals who had been awarded decorations in marble halls, the same men whose faces had appeared on Wehrmacht propaganda posters as the steel face of German resolve. And now they walked in the summer heat of a Russian city, under Soviet guard, watched by the people whose civilization they had come to destroy. The Iron Cross, that ancient symbol of German martial valor, awarded in its millions during the years of Wehrmacht conquest, had, by the summer of 1944, become something different. In the hands of men in Soviet captivity, it had become a document of failure, an artifact of a belief in superiority that the Eastern Front had spent 3 years patiently, implacably, and at unimaginable cost, disproving. Field Marshal Ernst Busch was relieved of command in early July and replaced by Field Marshal Walter Model, known throughout the Wehrmacht as Hitler's fireman, a general of almost supernatural energy and tactical resourcefulness who had repeatedly stabilized broken fronts across the Eastern theater. Model arrived in Belarusia and found a situation that even his extraordinary abilities could barely contain. The front had not simply been pushed back. It had been torn open. There was no coherent line to stabilize. There were gaps of 50, 60, 100 miles through which Soviet armored columns were driving westward, toward Poland, toward the borders of the Reich itself. Model looked at the maps and understood immediately what Busch's reports had not fully communicated, and what the Oak in East Prussia had been too stunned to fully absorb. Army Group Center, as a fighting formation, had ceased to exist. What remained were fragments, individual regiments, depleted battalions, roving groups of survivors trying to find each other in a landscape that was no longer German-controlled. The finest formation the German army had deployed in the East, the backbone of 3 years of warfare, had been destroyed in 9 weeks. The transformation that followed in the German high command was not a sudden or dramatic change. It came slowly, in the way that catastrophic truths always come to men who have built their entire identity around a different version of reality. It came in the form of officers who stopped arguing about the eventual prospects of German victory and began cautiously, and only in the most private conversations, speaking instead about managing the pace of defeat. It came in the growing frequency with which German generals requested transfers, cited health conditions, or suffered breakdowns that medical reports attributed to exhaustion and nervous strain. It came in the letters that German soldiers, the survivors of Bagration, sent home from their new positions, letters that had a different quality than the letters of 1941 and 1942, a flatness, a careful avoidance of the future tense, a focus on the immediate and the particular that was, to anyone who understood what it meant, the literary signature of men who no longer believed in tomorrow. The German generals who had presided over the destruction of Army Group Center had been, many of them, men of genuine intelligence and military talent. They were not fools. But they had been servants of a system that required them to believe what the system told them to believe, about German superiority, about Soviet inferiority, about the invincibility of the Wehrmacht, about the ideological destiny of the German nation. And the great cost of that servitude, the price of exchanging professional judgment for ideological loyalty, had been paid not by the generals themselves, but by the soldiers whose lives they commanded. The 500,000 men of Army Group Center, dead in Belarusian marshes, dying on the marching columns towards Soviet prison camps, buried in unmarked graves across 400 miles of contested countryside, they had paid that price. They had paid it for a belief that was never true. What remained, after the dust settled and the maps were redrawn, and the new front lines hardened into something approaching stability, was a simpler and harder truth than any the German High Command had been prepared to accept. The Soviet Union, despite every prediction of its collapse, had survived. It had rebuilt. It had learned. It had adapted with a speed and intelligence that the German generals had dismissed as impossible, because their ideology required them to dismiss it. And in the summer of 1944, it had demonstrated in the most brutal and definitive language available to history that the German army was not invincible, that German doctrine was not supreme, and that the war that Hitler had promised his generals would be a matter of weeks had become, instead, a war Germany could not win. The Iron Cross medals in the pockets of the generals who led the parade of the vanquished through the streets of Moscow on July 17, 1944, did not speak of glory any longer. They spoke of the distance between what a nation tells itself it is and what it actually is. They spoke of the cost of confusing military strength with moral rightness. They spoke of what happens when men surrender the faculty of honest judgment to the demands of a totalitarian belief. And walking behind those 19 generals, in a column that stretched for miles through the summer streets of the Soviet capital, 57,000 ordinary soldiers, young men from Bavaria and Prussia and Saxony and Rhineland, men who had followed their orders and believed their propaganda, and trusted their commanders, walked as the final, living evidence of a catastrophe that no Iron Cross could redeem and no propaganda could erase. The birds that sing above the forests of Belarusia today do not know the names of the divisions that were consumed in the summer of 1944. The marshes of the Pripyat do not hold their silence as mourning. The land simply endures, as land endures, indifferent to the great catastrophes that human ideology periodically demands of it. But history does not forget so easily. History holds in its ledgers the names of every army that was told it could not be beaten and then was beaten. It records every moment when the gap between what men believed and what was true became wide enough to swallow entire formations, entire armies, entire doctrines, entire civilizations. What happened to Army Group Center in the summer of 1944 is at its deepest level not simply a story about military catastrophe. It is a story about the price of false belief, about what it costs a nation and its soldiers when those in command mistake the certainty of conviction for the reliability of truth. And in that cost, measured in 400,000 casualties, in 28 destroyed divisions, in 19 generals marching through a foreign capital, is written one of the most sobering lessons that the Second World War left for those who came after. Power built on illusion does not simply fail. It fails catastrophically and at the greatest possible cost to the ordinary men who were never given the option of knowing the truth before they were asked to die for the lie.